The Sherman tank bucked like a wild horse as another Japanese shell exploded 20 yards to our left, showering us with volcanic ash and twisted metal. Through my periscope, I watched our sister tank, Iron Mike, disappear in a ball of orange flame, its crew screams lost in the thunder of battle. Mount Suribachi loomed ahead like a sleeping giant, its black slopes honeycombed with enemy guns that had already claimed half our armor. The ash was so thick I could taste sulfur and death with every breath. This was Iwo Jima, February 19, 1945, and we were driving straight into hell. My name is Sergeant Tommy Morrison, tank commander of Liberty Belle, a 30-ton Sherman M4A3 that had carried us from Saipan to this godforsaken island of volcanic glass. 4 months earlier, I'd been fixing tractors on my family's farm in Iowa. Now I was leading 4 good men into what the brass called the most fortified 8 square miles on Earth. Contact left. Anti-tank gun in the rocks. Our gunner, Corporal Jake Martinez from El Paso, had spotted the telltale muzzle flash through the drifting smoke. His voice was steady despite the chaos. Jake had been with us since Saipan, and his aim was true as scripture. Target acquired, Jake called out, his hands working the traverse and elevation wheels with practiced precision. The main gun swung toward the Japanese position hidden in the black volcanic rock. These weren't the desperate, poorly equipped enemy we'd faced on other islands. General Kuribayashi had turned Iwo Jima into a fortress with interconnected tunnels, concrete bunkers, and artillery pieces that could hit us from 3 directions at once. Fire, I commanded. The 75mm gun roared, and our tank shuddered from the recoil. Through the smoke and ash, I watched our high-explosive shells smash into the rocks where the enemy gun was hidden. Secondary explosions told us we'd hit something important, probably an ammunition store. Good shooting, Jake, I said into the intercom. Driver, advance 50 yards and hold. Private Danny O'Brien, our driver from Boston, worked the controls with hands that never stopped shaking. Not from fear, Danny was brave as they came, but from the constant vibration of the engine and the never-ending impacts of enemy fire. The ash was murder on our tracks and engine, clogging air filters and jamming mechanisms that had worked perfectly on every other Pacific island. We'd been on Iwo Jima for 6 hours, and it felt like 6 years. The battle had begun before dawn with the largest naval bombardment in Pacific history. For 3 days, our battleships and cruisers had pounded this island with shells the size of telephone poles. Admiral Turner's fleet had fired over 22,000 rounds of heavy ammunition, turning the sky orange and making the earth shake like an earthquake. We'd watched from our transports, confident that nothing could survive such devastation. We were wrong. The Japanese had dug deeper than we'd ever imagined. General Kuribayashi had spent 8 months turning Iwo Jima into an underground fortress. 11 miles of tunnels connected over 1,000 caves and bunkers. The enemy had stockpiled ammunition, food, and water for a siege that could last months. When our bombardment ended and the first wave of Marines hit the beaches, the island came alive with hidden guns. From my position in the turret, I could see the black sand beaches where the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions were fighting for every yard. The volcanic ash was so fine it got into everything, weapons, radio equipment, and the lungs of every man on the island. Marines were sinking up to their ankles in the stuff, making every step a struggle while Japanese mortars and machine guns cut them down from concealed positions. That's where we came in. The Marines needed armor support to crack the enemy's defensive lines, but the ash was proving nearly as deadly as enemy fire. 3 tanks from our company had already bogged down in the deeper drifts, their crews forced to abandon them as Japanese infantry swarmed forward with magnetic mines and satchel charges. Sergeant Morrison, came the voice of our loader, Private First Class Billy Chen from San Francisco. Billy was the youngest member of our crew at 19, but he could handle the heavy 75mm shells like they were baseballs. We're down to 20 rounds of high explosive and 30 rounds of armor piercing. I did the math in my head. At our current rate of fire, we had maybe 2 hours of ammunition left. The supply convoys were having a hell of a time getting through the ash and enemy fire to reach us. Some of the ammo trucks had been destroyed by Japanese artillery that seemed to come from every direction at once. "Make every shot count, Billy," I replied. Through my periscope, I could see the Marines of the 28th Regiment preparing for another assault on Mount Suribachi's lower slopes. These were the same Marines who would plant our flag on that mountain in 4 days, but right now they were pinned down by machine gun fire from positions we couldn't even see. The Japanese defensive strategy was unlike anything we'd encountered in the Pacific. Instead of fighting to the last man on the beaches like they had at Tarawa and Saipan, General Kuribayashi had pulled his forces inland to prepared positions where they could inflict maximum casualties on our advancing forces. Every ridge, every boulder, every depression in the volcanic rock concealed enemy fighters who would pop up, fire, and disappear before we could return effective fire. Movement to our right, called our assistant driver and machine gunner, Corporal Sam Turner from Alabama. Sam manned the .30 caliber machine gun mounted in the hull and had eyes like a hawk. Looks like Japs trying to flank the Marines. I traversed the turret to get a better view. Sure enough, about 30 Japanese soldiers were moving through a shallow ravine, trying to get behind the Marine positions. They carried the usual mix of rifles, light machine guns, and satchel charges designed to destroy our tanks. These weren't the fanatical bonsai charges we'd seen on other islands. These men were moving with discipline and purpose, using the terrain to mask their approach. "Jake, can you get an angle on that ravine?" I asked. "Negative, Sergeant. Too much rock in the way. We'd have to move forward another 100 yards. I weighed our options. Moving forward would expose us to more anti-tank fire, but if those Japanese soldiers reached the Marines, a lot of good men would die. The ash was so thick that close air support was nearly impossible, and our artillery was having trouble with forward observation in the limited visibility. "Danny, take us forward." Nice and slow. The Sherman lurched ahead, its tracks grinding through the volcanic ash with a sound like sandpaper on steel. The ash was getting into everything. Our periscopes were constantly fogging up, and the engine was running hot from clogged air filters. Danny had to stop every few minutes to let the engine cool down, making us sitting ducks for enemy gunners. As we advanced, I kept my eyes on the ridgelines where Japanese observers were undoubtedly calling in artillery strikes. The enemy had pre-registered every possible avenue of approach, and their artillery was devastatingly accurate. In the first 6 hours of fighting, we'd lost more tanks to enemy fire than in any previous Pacific operation. Suddenly, the ground 20 feet in front of us erupted in a fountain of ash and rock. A Japanese mortar team had our range, and they were walking their fire toward our position. "Reverse! Reverse!" I shouted into the intercom. Danny threw the Sherman into reverse, but the tracks were losing traction in the deep ash. We were stuck, sitting targets for Thennick's mortar round. I could hear the whistle of incoming shells and knew we had seconds before they found our range. "Bail out," I ordered, but Jake was already traversing the main gun toward the mortar position he'd spotted on a ridge 800 yards away. "I've got them, Sergeant." The 75 fired, and I watched our shell arc through the ash-filled air toward the enemy position. The explosion sent bodies and equipment tumbling down the volcanic slope, but I knew there were more mortars out there, and they all had our coordinates. Danny managed to rock the tank forward, and slowly we began to move again. The tracks found purchase on a patch off harder ground, and we lurched toward a position where Jake could engage the Japanese soldiers in the ravine. Through my periscope, I could see the Marines were taking heavy casualties. The black sand was already stained red in dozens of places, and corpsmen were dragging wounded men toward whatever cover they could find. The volcanic ash made it nearly impossible to dig proper foxholes, so the Marines were fighting from whatever natural cover they could find in the rocky terrain. "Target acquired," Jake called out, He'd found an angle where he could drop high explosive shells into the ravine where the Japanese soldiers were advancing. Firing. The gun roared again, and I watched the shell explode among the enemy troops. Bodies flew in all directions, and the survivors scattered for whatever cover they could find. But this was Iwo Jima, and there were always more enemy soldiers ready to take their place. As we provided covering fire for the Marines, I began to understand the true horror of this battle. The Japanese had turned the entire island into a killing field. Every position we captured during the day, they would infiltrate at night through their tunnel system. Men would go to sleep thinking they were safe, only to wake up with Japanese soldiers in their foxholes. The ash was making everything worse. It got into weapons and caused them to jam at critical moments. Radio communications were sporadic because the fine particles interfered with electronic equipment. Worst of all, it was nearly impossible to see more than 50 yards in any direction, which meant the enemy could get close enough to use their most deadly weapons, satchel charges, and magnetic mines that could destroy even our heavily armored tanks. "Sergeant, we've got company." Sam Turner's voice crackled through the intercom. Through his periscope, he'd spotted Japanese infantry moving toward our position, staying low and using the ash clouds for concealment. I grabbed the tank commander's .50 caliber machine gun and traversed it toward the approaching enemy soldiers. The Japanese on Iwo Jima were different from those we'd fought on other islands. These men were veterans, many of them survivors of the elite units that had been decimated in earlier battles. They knew American tactics and had adapted their own to counter our advantages in firepower and mobility. The .50 caliber opened up with its distinctive heavy bark, sending tracers streaking through the ash-laden air. I watched enemy soldiers dive for cover behind volcanic rocks, but others kept advancing with a determination that was both admirable and terrifying. These men knew they weren't going home. General Kuribayashi had told them that their job was to kill as many Americans as possible before they died. One Japanese soldier made it to within 30 yards of our tank before Sam's whole machine gun cut him down. He'd been carrying a magnetic mine, a weapon that could have disabled or destroyed our Sherman if he'd managed to attach it to our hull. The fact that he'd gotten so close through our defensive fire showed just how dangerous these enemy troops were. "Danny, get us out of here," I ordered. "We're too exposed." But as our driver tried to move the tank, the tracks began spinning uselessly in the volcanic ash. We were stuck again, and I could see more Japanese soldiers moving toward us from multiple directions. They were coordinating their attack, using hand signals and moving with the precision of veteran troops. This was the nightmare scenario every tank commander feared, being immobilized in enemy territory with infantry closing in from all sides. Our main gun was powerful, but it couldn't depress low enough to hit targets close to the tank. The machine guns were our only defense, and we were rapidly running low on ammunition. "Jake, hit that cluster of rocks to our left with high explosive," I commanded. "Maybe we can start a rock slide to block their approach." The main gun swung toward the target, and Jake fired. The shell exploded against the volcanic rock, sending chunks of lava flying in all directions. Several Japanese soldiers were caught in the blast, but others kept coming, their faces blackened with ash and their eyes burning with fanatical determination. Billy Chen was passing ammunition up from the hull, his young face streaked with sweat and volcanic dust. Despite the chaos around us, he never missed a beat, keeping our guns fed with the shells we needed to stay alive. In the cramped confines of the tank, with the temperature approaching 120 degrees and the constant noise of gunfire and explosions, it took tremendous courage just to keep functioning. Suddenly, our luck changed. A Marine rifle platoon that had been pinned down behind a ridge managed to flank the Japanese positions and open fire with rifles and automatic weapons. The enemy soldiers found themselves caught between our tank's guns and the Marines' rifle fire. Within minutes, the immediate threat to our position was eliminated. "Good shooting, Marines," I called out through the tank's external speaker system. The Marine lieutenant raised his hand in acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the battle for Mount Suribachi. Danny finally managed to rock the tank free from the ash drift that had trapped us, and we began moving again toward our assigned position. Our job was to support the Marine assault on the mountain's lower slopes, where Japanese defenders had turned every cave and crevice into a fortress. As we advanced, I could see the full scope of the battle unfolding around us. Offshore, the massive guns of our battleships and cruisers continued their bombardment, sending shells the size of automobiles into the mountain slopes. But the Japanese had dug so deep and built their position so well that most of the naval gunfire was having little effect on their defensive capabilities. On the beaches, landing craft continued to bring in reinforcements and supplies despite constant enemy fire. The coxswains of those boats were showing incredible courage, navigating through artillery fire and mortar barrages to deliver the men and equipment we needed to win this battle. Many of the landing craft were damaged or destroyed, their crews killed or wounded while trying to support the assault. The Marines themselves were performing with the skill and courage that had made them legendary throughout the Pacific. But even these elite troops were being tested to their limits by the unique challenges of Iwo Jima. The volcanic ash made movement difficult and visibility poor. The enemy's tunnel system allowed them to appear anywhere at any time, and the sheer intensity of the defensive fire was unlike anything we'd encountered in previous amphibious assaults. "Sergeant Morrison, this is Bulldog 6, came the voice of our company commander, Captain James MacArthur, over the radio. "We need you to support a Marine assault on Grid Square 347. Heavy enemy resistance in prepared positions." I checked our map coordinates. Grid Square 347 was at the base of Mount Suribachi, where the Japanese had built some of their strongest defensive positions. Intelligence reports indicated at least 3 reinforced companies of enemy troops, supported by artillery and mortar positions higher up on the mountain slopes. "Roger, Bulldog 6. Moving to Grid Square 347. As we approached the designated area, the intensity of enemy fire increased dramatically. Japanese artillery observers on Mount Suribachi had perfect visibility over the entire southern portion of the island, and they were directing accurate fire on any target that presented itself. Several times, we had to stop and take cover as heavy shells bracketed our position. Through my periscope, I could see the Marines preparing for their assault. These were men of the 28th Regiment, 5th Marine Division, the same unit that would eventually capture Mount Suribachi and raise the American flag in one of the most famous photographs in military history. But that triumph was still days away, and right now these Marines were facing some of the toughest fighting in the entire Pacific War. The Marine assault began with a barrage from our supporting artillery, but the shells seemed to have little effect on the Japanese positions. The enemy had built their bunkers and caves with overhead protection that could withstand all but direct hits from the heaviest shells. As soon as our barrage lifted, enemy machine guns and mortars opened fire on the advancing Marines. "Jake, do you have targets?" I asked our gunner. "I can see muzzle flashes from at least 3 machine gun positions," he replied. "Range about 600 yards, but they're well concealed in the rocks. Take them out, one at a time." Jake began engaging the enemy positions with high explosive shells, each one carefully aimed at the telltale muzzle flashes that revealed Japanese gun positions. The main gun fired repeatedly, and I watched our shells explode against the volcanic rock with tremendous force. But the Japanese had built their positions well, and most of the enemy guns continued firing despite our best efforts. The Marines were taking heavy casualties as they advanced across the open ground toward the enemy positions. The volcanic ash provided no cover, and the Japanese had interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach route. I watched through my periscope as Marine after Marine fell to enemy bullets, their bodies disappearing into the black sand that seemed to swallow everything. "We need to get closer," I decided. "Danny, take us forward another 200 yards. Moving closer to the enemy positions was dangerous, but it was the only way we could provide effective air support for the Marine assault. As we advanced, Japanese anti-tank weapons began engaging us with increasing accuracy. Shells exploded all around our tank, filling the air with fragments of volcanic rock and twisted metal. Suddenly, there was a tremendous impact against our front armor, and the tank shuddered from the blow. A Japanese anti-tank gun had scored a direct hit, but our thick frontal armor had deflected the shell. Still, the impact had damaged some of our vision blocks, making it even harder to see through the ash-filled air. "Everyone okay?" I called out through the intercom. "Trevor's okay," Danny reported. "But we're losing oil pressure. That hit must have damaged something in the engine compartment." "Gunner's okay," Jake added. "But the main gun traverse is getting sluggish. All this ash is getting into the mechanisms." We were still fighting effectively, but the tank was slowly being degraded by the combination of enemy fire and the hostile environment of Iwo Jima. Every piece of equipment on the island was suffering from the effects of the volcanic ash, which got into everything and gradually wore down mechanical systems that had been designed for more conventional battlefields. Despite our mechanical problems, we continued supporting the Marine assault. Jake systematically engaged every enemy position he could identify, while Sam and I used our machine guns to suppress Japanese infantry that tried to interfere with the Marine advance. Billy kept us supplied with ammunition, despite the fact that enemy fire was making it increasingly dangerous to move around inside the tank. Slowly, painfully, the Marines began to make progress. Individual squads found ways to work around the enemy's prepared positions, using grenades and flamethrowers to clear bunkers and caves. The fighting was close and brutal, with Marines and Japanese soldiers sometimes grappling hand-to-hand in the confined spaces of the underground fortifications. By late afternoon, the Marines had captured several key positions at the base of Mount Suribachi, but at a terrible cost. More than half the men who had started the assault were now casualties, killed or wounded by the intense enemy fire. The volcanic ash was stained red with blood in dozens of places, and corpsmen were working frantically to evacuate the wounded to aid stations further back from the fighting. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the volcanic landscape, we received orders to pull back to a defensive position for the night. The Japanese were known for their night infiltration tactics, and our commanders wanted our tanks in positions where they could support the Marine perimeters against enemy counterattacks. "Danny, can you get us back to the rally point?" I asked our driver. "I'll try, Sergeant, but the engine's running pretty rough. We're definitely losing oil, and the transmission is making some ugly noises." We began moving slowly toward the rear, nursing our damaged tank through the treacherous volcanic terrain. Behind us, I could see Marines digging in for what would undoubtedly be a long and dangerous night. The Japanese had already begun their harassment tactics, sending small groups of infiltrators to procure lines and cause casualties among men who were already exhausted from a day of brutal fighting. As we reached our designated position, I could see other tanks from our company establishing defensive positions. Several were missing, destroyed by enemy fire or immobilized by mechanical failures caused by the volcanic ash. The crews of the disabled tanks had been evacuated, but we were now operating with less than half our original strength. Our tank crew worked through the night, performing maintenance on Liberty Belle and preparing for another day of fighting. Billy and Sam cleaned the machine guns and organized our remaining ammunition. Jake worked on the main gun, trying to free up the traverse mechanism that had been jammed by volcanic ash. Danny and I did what we could to address the engine problems, but without proper repair facilities, our options were limited. Despite our exhaustion, none of us could sleep. The sounds of battle continued throughout the night as Japanese infiltrators probed our lines and Marine sentries fought to keep them out of our defensive positions. Flares lit up the sky at regular intervals, casting eerie shadows across the lunar landscape of volcanic ash and twisted metal. As dawn approached on February 20th, our secondé on Iwo Jima, we could see the full extent of the previous day's fighting. The beaches were littered with destroyed landing craft and damaged equipment. Supply dumps were scattered across the volcanic sand, many of them damaged by enemy artillery fire. Wounded men were still being evacuated to hospital ships offshore, their groans and cries a constant reminder of the price we were paying for every yard of ground. But despite the casualties and setbacks, more American forces were coming ashore. The 3rd Marine Division was landing to reinforce our assault, bringing fresh troops and additional equipment to continue the battle for Iwo Jima. Offshore, our naval forces continued their bombardment, sending hundreds of shells into suspected enemy positions throughout the island. "Mount up," came the order from Captain MacArthur. We were going back into action, supporting another Marine assault on Mount Suribachi's slopes. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese had used the night to reinforce their positions and prepare for another day of desperate fighting. As we prepared Liberty Belle for another day of combat, I looked up at Mount Suribachi looming ahead of us. The mountain seemed to watch us with malevolent eyes, its slopes honeycombed with enemy positions that had already cost us so many good men. But we were Americans, and we had a job to do. The Japanese might fight with fanatical courage, but we had something even more powerful, the determination to finish what we'd started and go home to the country we loved. "Driver, move out," I commanded, and once again we headed toward the sound of the guns. The second day of fighting was even more intense than the first. The Japanese had used the night to reposition their forces and prepare new defensive positions. Every cave, every boulder, every depression in the volcanic rock seemed to conceal enemy soldiers ready to fight to the death. Our tanks supported Marine assaults throughout the day, engaging enemy positions with high explosive shell-sand machine gun fire. Jake's marksmanship was exceptional. He destroyed at least a dozen enemy positions during the course of the day, including several anti-tank guns that had been threatening other American units. But the cost was terrible. By the end of the second day, our Marine infantry units had suffered over 50% casualties. The volcanic ash was making medical evacuation difficult, and many wounded men had to wait hours before they could be moved to aid stations. The corpsmen were performing with incredible courage, repeatedly exposing themselves to enemy fire to reach wounded Marines. Our own tank was continuing to deteriorate. The engine was running on borrowed time, and we were down to our last few rounds of ammunition. Several of our vision blocks had been damaged by enemy fire, and the volcanic ash was causing constant mechanical problems. But we kept fighting because that's what Marines do. We never give up, and we never leave our buddies behind. On the third day, February 21st, we received word that elements of the 28th Regiment were preparing for a final assault on Mount Suribachi summit. The mountain had become a symbol of Japanese resistance, and its capture would provide a tremendous boost to American morale while denying the enemy their best observation and artillery positions. Liberty Belle was assigned to support the assault, despite our mechanical problems. Danny had managed to keep the engine running through a combination of skill and pure determination, while Jake had improvised repairs to the main gun that kept it operational despite the constant jamming caused by volcanic ash. The assault began before dawn on February 23rd, with Marine patrols working their way up the mountain slopes under cover of darkness. The Japanese resistance was fierce, but gradually weakening as our forces methodically cleared one position after another. The enemy was running low on ammunition and supplies, and many of their best troops had been killed or wounded in the previous days of fighting. As the sun rose, we could see Marines near the summit of Mount Suribachi, preparing to plant an American flag on the highest point of the mountain. Through my periscope, I watched as the flag was raised, its red, white, and blue colors bright against the dark volcanic rock. A tremendous cheer went up from American forces throughout the southern portion of the island. Marines, sailors, and soldiers who had been fighting for their lives for the past 4 days paused in their battles to watch the flag go up on Mount Suribachi. It was a moment of triumph that none of us would ever forget. But even as we celebrated the capture of Mount Suribachi, the battle for Iwo Jima was far from over. The northern portion of the island was still held by thousands of Japanese troops in prepared positions that were even stronger than those we'd just captured. General Kuribayashi had established his command post in that area, and he was determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price for their victory. Liberty Belle continued to serve with distinction during the remaining weeks of the battle. We supported Marine and Army units as they fought their way across the island's rocky terrain, engaging enemy positions and providing crucial fire support for infantry assaults. The volcanic ash continued to cause mechanical problems, but our crew's skill and determination kept the tank operational when other vehicles had been abandoned. Jake Martinez proved to be one of the finest tank gunners in the entire Pacific Theater. His accurate fire destroyed dozens of enemy positions and saved countless American lives. Danny O'Brien's driving skills were legendary. He could navigate terrain that other drivers considered impassable, and his mechanical knowledge kept our engine running under conditions that would have defeated less skilled operators. Billy Chen and Sam Turner performed with the courage and professionalism that characterized the entire Marine Corps during World War II. Billy's speed and accuracy as a loader kept our guns firing at maximum rate, while Sam's marksmanship with the machine guns eliminated numerous enemy threats. Both men repeatedly exposed themselves to danger to keep our tank fighting effectively. On March 26, 1945, after 36 days of some of the most brutal fighting in military history, the island of Iwo Jima was declared secure. The Japanese had lost their entire garrison, over 18,000 men, while American casualties totaled more than 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed in action. It was the costliest battle in Marine Corps history, but it had achieved its strategic objectives. The capture of Iwo Jima provided the United States with air bases that could support the final assault on Japan itself. More importantly, it demonstrated American determination to pay any price necessary to achieve victory over the Japanese Empire. The battle showed both sides that the invasion of Japan would result in casualties on a scale that neither country could easily accept. As I write this account many years after the war, I often think about the lessons we learned on that sulfur island. We learned that courage comes in many forms. The Marine rifleman advancing across open ground under enemy fire, the Navy corpsman treating wounded men while shells exploded around him, the tank driver keeping his engine running despite mechanical failures that should have left us stranded. We learned that victory requires sacrifice, and that freedom is never free. The volcanic ash of Iwo Jima was stained with the blood of thousands of young Americans who gave their lives so that future generations could live in peace. We learned that in the darkest moments of battle, ordinary men can perform extraordinary acts of heroism. Most importantly, we learned that when Americans are tested in the crucible of combat, they do not break. We bend, we suffer casualties, we face setbacks and defeats, but we never give up. We keep fighting until the job is done, no matter how long it takes or how much it costs. Liberty Belle survived the Battle of Iwo Jima and went on to serve in the occupation of Japan. But her real service was those 36 days on that volcanic island, supporting Marine infantry in some of the toughest fighting of World War II. The tank was eventually scrapped after the war, but the memories of her crew live on in the stories we tell and the lessons we pass down to future generations. Mount Suribachi no longer watches over a battlefield. Today, it stands as a memorial to the thousands of men, both American and Japanese, who fought and died on its slopes. The volcanic ash has been covered by vegetation, and the caves and bunkers have been sealed or collapsed. But the mountain remembers, and so do those of us who were privileged to serve there. When people ask me about Iwo Jima, I tell them about the courage of Marine infantry advancing across open ground under withering enemy fire. I tell them about Navy corpsmen who repeatedly exposed themselves to danger to save wounded men. I tell them about tank crews who kept fighting despite mechanical failures and overwhelming odds. But most of all, I tell them about the price of freedom. Every generation of Americans faces its own test, its own moment when the country's survival depends on the courage and determination of ordinary citizens called to extraordinary service. For my generation, that test came on islands scattered across the Pacific Ocean, places with names like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. We passed that test, but only because we remembered what we were fighting for. We were fighting for the right of free people to govern themselves. We were fighting for the principle that might does not make right, and that aggression will be met with determined resistance. Most of all, we were fighting for each other, for the Marine in the next foxhole, for the sailor on the next ship, for the pilot in the next aircraft. The Battle of Iwo Jima ended more than 70 years ago, but its lessons remain relevant today. In a world where freedom is still threatened by those who would impose their will through force, we must remember that liberty requires constant vigilance and occasional sacrifice. We must remember that when good men and women stand together against tyranny, they cannot be defeated. Mount Suribachi watched us burn, but it also watched us prevail. The mountain saw young Americans face their greatest test and emerge victorious. It witnessed the birth of legends and the forging of heroes who would carry the memory of that battle for the rest of their lives. Today, when I look at the American flag, I remember how it looked flying from the summit of Mount Suribachi on that February morning in 1945. I remember the cheer that went up from thousands of American voices, and I remember the pride we felt in knowing that our sacrifice had not been in vain. That flag still flies today because men like Jake Martinez, Danny O'Brien, Billy Chen, and Sam Turner were willing to climb into a metal box and drive it into hell for their country. It flies because Marine riflemen were willing to advance across open ground against impossible odds. It flies because Americans of every race, creed, and background came together in the common cause of freedom. The ash of Iwo Jima has settled, but the flame of liberty burns as bright as ever. That flame was lit by the sacrifice of those who fell on that volcanic island, and it is our responsibility to keep it burning for future generations. We owe them nothing less than our continued vigilance, our continued dedication to the principles they died defending, and our continued commitment to the idea that freedom is worth any price. Mount Suribachi watched us burn, but from those flames rose a phoenix of liberty that soars still. And as long as Americans remember the lessons of Iwo Jima, as long as we honor the memory of those who fell, that phoenix will continue to soar over a land of the free and a home of the brave.